Americans, you're taking our jobs, and the rest of the world is watching you.
There's no reason that this case needed to become a national issue. There's no reason that this case needed to go to the United States Supreme Court. And it's been the government that's done that at every step of the way.
I think actually one of the things that we need to do is think about how to reform the Senate so that also there isn't so much power in the hands of just a few people.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, that means you and I, can stop talking about tariffs in China. It's an embargo. It's a trade embargo. Why? Well, because China today increased its tariff rate against the United States to 125%. The current U.S. rate on Chinese goods, 145%. At that rate, effectively, we're not talking about tariffs. We're talking about a trade embargo. Possibly related to this, American confidence in the future of the U.S. economy dropped to the second lowest level on record going back to 1952.
The Chinese reaction this morning is not terribly surprising, but certainly unfortunate. No one else has retaliated against these reciprocal tariffs yet. China got out ahead and decided to do it.
We have on the show, probably inordinately, paid a lot of attention to the stock market. Well, today, after a very chaotic week, the Dow ended up, as did all the other indices, possibly with some imagined or real optimism that China does want to eventually strike a deal and end what is effectively a trade embargo. The rise on the Dow, just you can see it there, just over 600 points. Plus, here's a question. It's been playing out all week, right behind tariffs. Where is Kilmar Abrego Garcia? The Supreme Court orders the man mistakenly deported to El Salvador to be returned to the United States. But today, during a court hearing, the Justice Department under the Trump administration would not say where he is or what it's doing, if anything, to try to find out. We're tracking the latest on that case. But we start tonight with Vin Gomez, with me right here at the desk, and J.D. Durkin in New York. J.D., this is not an easy question to answer, and I hesitate to impose upon you this burden, but try to wrap up the week that was in the equity markets.
Well, yeah, that's certainly no easy question here, Major. And of course, let's be clear, on any given day, it's really impossible to discern any one particular reason why the overall stock market goes higher or goes lower. But I think most voices on Wall Street would say, given how aggressive the selling was going back to last Thursday, April 3rd, that was a 5% drawdown, Major. The very next day, Friday the 4th, another 6%. We hit what's called oversold territory. And in fact, at one point earlier in the week, we actually reached what's called a bear market territory. And that's when the S&P 500 falls 20% off of its recent highs. And those recent highs, Major, we can't forget, it's only 6 or 7 weeks ago. February 19th was an all-time high for the stock market, both for the Dow, the S&P, as well as the tech-heavy NASDAQ. And that tells us just how quickly that sentiment shift has really worked its way across Wall Street. Uncertainty is certainly the name of the game. Today, we kicked off the new earnings season, Major. Today and over the next few weeks, that's really expected to be what we hear from CEOs. I think the market was overall and oversold, and we're going to have some of these relief rallies from time to time, but a whole bunch of uncertainty in all the sessions in between.
And JD, let me follow up on that point, because you have lived through, I have lived through market fluctuations, big up and down. And usually those big downs are caused by external events. 9/11, the Great Recession, COVID. This is an internal event driven by the White House itself. That makes it fundamentally different.
Every major voice on Wall Street I spoke with the last few days tells me it's unlike '87. It's unlike, that was the Black Monday crash, of course, because this is unique. This is, as many people call it, the ego of the president. Some say this is the art of the deal. But regardless, this is manufactured and in many ways sort of self-imposed by the president. And to that regard, I think it largely caught Wall Street off guard. Although, as Finn certainly knows, Finn and I were colleagues covering the first Trump administration. We know that tariffs were front and center. Everyone knew that tariffs would be a fundamental part of the playbook this time around. No one expected them to be as sweeping, as aggressive, really caught Wall Street flat-footed. Now I think we have a better sense after the last 7 trading days to expect the unexpected, but I'm sure we are still in for a lot of volatile sessions moving forward on Wall Street.
JD, hang out there for me. I want to talk to Finn about this because, as we've just discussed, this is set in motion by the White House. There are political ramifications already unfolding across the country, particularly within the Republican Party. What are you hearing?
Well, first of all, I mean, I will say that in speaking with sources close to the White House, that keyword uncertainty is something I've heard a lot today, Major. uncertainty of where we are because of this trade war, this trade embargo, excuse me, where we are. One person close to the White House told me when you're seeing the bond yields go up and the dollar go down, that's never a good sign. Like now, looking at the political impact, and I am a political guy, so are you, Major.
The political director of CBS News,
Indeed,
ladies and gentlemen.
Indeed. There we go. And be focused on politics. What I've been hearing is there is some concern. Look, we're only in April of 2025, but there is a lot of talk and a lot of chatter and some apprehension over the forecast of 2026. Yes, because, look, in speaking to sources close to the White House, they have told me, look, some of these House and Senate Republicans who right now are solidified behind the president, most of them, look, they're going to start seeing some internal polling that's going to come out a little later this year, roughly around the summer. And when they start seeing some of that and looking at the pace of where we are on this trajectory, it could have a negative effect. And they are nervous about what this will mean looking ahead to 2026 and Republicans' changes.
Finn, at this table yesterday afternoon, Kevin Sheridan, a pretty plugged-in Republican strategist, said, this pause helps, but the president and the White House need to start announcing some trade deals sooner rather than later, because if it doesn't, then this uncertainty that you just mentioned will not only continue, but the sense that these negotiations are going to land something important will begin to dissipate.
Right now, what we're hearing from the White House is trust. But what even some of his base supporters want to see are results. And you're not going to see that unless some of these trade deals that they're talking about, 75 plus, where are they? What I've been hearing also is that we could see, again, from sources close to the White House, that we could see a deal. A prediction was that we could see a deal with a deal between the EU and China before we could see a deal with China and the U.S. Look, some of our trade allies or former trade allies are looking elsewhere because of this. We're not the only game in town, and we're seeing that across the landscape.
JD, I want to go back to you in New York. You covered the first Trump administration. I did. Finn did. One of the things that was part of that tariff conversation then was a process that played out, investigations under applicable law. Now the president's declaring an emergency, and it's a global trade impact that no one can quite either measure or understand its duration. That's part of this volatility, is it not?
It absolutely is. And to the point about earnings season kicking off this morning, we heard from Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. We heard from Larry Fink at BlackRock, the CEOs of Wells Fargo and Morgan Stanley, and many others. And it's very difficult for any publicly traded company to issue forward-looking guidance. And we can't forget, that's ultimately what the stock market invests in. You think about it psychologically as an investor. You put your money into the market for the hope, the expectation, the optimism that tomorrow the dollar you put in will be worth more than that dollar is worth now. But it is nearly impossible to get those forecasts from these publicly traded companies when the president can say or tweet one thing at 10 a.m., say or tweet something fundamentally different by 2 p.m. And that whipsaw effect back and forth and that whiplash that all of Wall Street is expecting, that really underscores the difficulty for investors to have confidence in what the president says, given that can change hour by hour.
Finn, I do want to also ground this in reality, because this week was important for the White House. House Republicans passed the budget resolution, which keeps the process of obtaining tax cuts and other parts of the economic agenda on course. There were two very positive inflation readings. Yes. And the job market remains relatively strong. These are low-lying but important fundamentals. And I don't want to forget that in this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. The president has had some wins here. Like if you look at some of these metrics, including those inflation reports, and not just looking at the consumer confidence. However, some of these metrics were done before, were pre-tariff.
Right.
We have to remember that. So like really, we're going to see some more metrics come in the future. That's really what we have to look at to really determine where we are right now in our country.
Uncertainty in Wall Street, uncertainty at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Finn Gomez, J.D. Durkin, thanks so very much. I appreciate it. The Justice Department told a federal judge today it did not have answers to questions posed by a judge about a man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador, how the judge responded, and what all this back and forth may mean for Kilmar Abrego Garcia and his case. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. We are following several significant developments in many prominent immigration cases, all revolving around actions taken by the Trump administration. CBS News Department of Justice correspondent Scott McFarland is with me at the desk, and CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camilo Montoya Galvez joins me now from Jena, Louisiana. Camilo, I'll get to you in just a second. The signal was breaking up ever so slightly. We'll keep an eye on the gremlins there in Jenna, Louisiana. Scott, you're here with me at the desk. No single signal breakup here. Catch us up on this back and forth today in a federal district court over Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the man incorrectly, by the Trump administration's own admission, deported to El Salvador.
A man mistakenly deported to an international prison. This is a mistake that's got to get fixed, and soon, according to the representatives of Mr. Abrego Garcia, and according to the judge
and the Supreme Court,
and according to a 9-0 ruling from the Supreme Court. Where did it go today? Well, there was a hearing, an emergency hearing scheduled. The judge asked the Department of Justice a few point-blank questions. What's his condition? Where is he? Whose control is he under? The Department of Justice didn't answer any of those questions, saying they walked into the courtroom without getting that information from the Trump administration. It did not go over well.
One might say they slow-walked.
I think that's charitable, but the judge put in the docket today something quite striking and very representative of this moment, that the Department of Justice failed to follow a court order, which makes this a bigger situation than just the case of Mr. Abrego Garcia. If there's going to be defied court orders, you start rumbling and shaking the foundations of democracy. She's ordered another hearing for early next week and says she wants daily updates until she gets an answer as to where Mr. Abrego Garcia is and why he's not back home right now.
Camilo, you're in Jenna, Louisiana, following the case of Mahmoud Khalil. What happened today?
Hi, Major. A federal immigration judge at the Justice Department inside this detention facility behind me in Louisiana ruled that the Trump administration can continue and move forward with its effort to deport Columbia University activist Mahmoud Khalil. The Trump administration has cited 2 legal grounds under U.S. immigration law, Major, to try to deport Mr. Khalil. The first one is invoking a little-known immigration law that allows the Secretary of State to determine that a non-citizen is deportable because his or her presence or activities in the U.S. pose adverse foreign policy consequences for the U.S. The judge sustained that deportation ground, saying that the DHS had met its burden to make him deportable under this law. But the judge did hold in abeyance the second immigration violation allegation, which is that, according to the DHS, Mr. Khalil engaged in immigration fraud by not disclosing certain information in his green card application. So this is obviously a significant legal setback for Mr. Khalil and his team, and a victory for the Trump administration, which has been targeting foreign students on college campuses who it says are engaging in activity that is pro-Hamas. Of course, the administration has never presented evidence, Major, we should note, that links Mr. Khalil to Hamas or any other terrorist group. And I should note that concluding this hearing, Mr. Khalil was able to speak and offer some remarks. And he said that the judge in this case had previously talked, Major, about the notions of due process and fundamental fairness, quote unquote, but he said those principles were not followed in this case.
And Camila, we're focusing on this case not only because of the free speech implications it might have, but also it's a test for this kind of maximalist use of available laws running across a spectrum of U.S. law, not necessarily particularly or granularly related to immigration, nevertheless being applied to potential deportations.
Yes, Major, the Trump administration is moving aggressively to fulfill the president's promise to conduct the largest deportation operation in American history, and in the process is invoking little-known, rarely used immigration laws, including this Secretary of State power to pursue people like Mr. Khalil, but also the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to deport suspected members of Tren de Aragua. But we know that many of the individuals sent to that Salvadorian prison under this wartime authority are alleging now, Major, that they are indeed not gang members. And so this will continue to be contested in the federal court system, but the administration is not hesitant at all to use these rarely invoked sections of the immigration law, which are objectively very harsh and sweeping in nature.
Camila Montoya Galvez in Jenna, Louisiana, thank you very much. Scott, I want to talk to you about this case involving Henry Villatora Santos. There were lots of accusations made in a kind of heavily publicized event near the nation's capital a few days ago. And there's been a substantial reversal from the Department of Justice. Walk us through that.
Remarkably curious case. There was a news conference scheduled by the U.S. Attorney General, carried live on many of the cable networks a couple weeks ago, announcing the arrest of an MS-13 leader, the East Coast leader, they said.
That's what they said.
Responsible for violence, all kinds of violence all across the country. They just dropped his case a couple days ago at the federal courthouse in Virginia, which got us asking, well, why would you drop the case of the MS-13 leader?
Someone that the Attorney General Pam Bondi called very violent crimes. Anything you can associate with MS-13. He was the leader of it. All of the violent crimes, unquote.
Three big issues here. First of all, the indication is they want to drop the case so they can just quickly deport him. But there's two problems there. First of all, there would be victims and victims' families of all that violence that would like to have their day in court, have some justice, have them held accountable in the U.S. What's more, if you don't go to court and make any accusations, and they've specified none of this in their court filings, how do you have to prove it? What do you have to show that those allegations are true before you deport him to El Salvador or elsewhere? This is raising a lot of concerns with critics of the Trump administration.
And there's a precedent of doing this, prosecuting someone so once they are deported, they can never come back in.
We had a former federal prosecutor tell CBS News this is exactly the person you do prosecute, to first of all, for a deterrence message, second of all, to avoid him ever getting back in the U.S.
If the evidence is strong enough to prosecute. Scott McFarland at the desk. I appreciate it very much. In just a few weeks, the LGBTQ plus community will gather here in Washington for World Pride, but the event may come with a warning for those who identify as transgender. The executive director of Capital Pride Alliance has said, in light of new Trump administration anti-trans federal policies, it may be too dangerous for trans people to visit the nation's capital. The group may soon send those participants an official warning. Interestingly, Canada's largest LGBTQ plus advocacy group has already said it will not participate in the event and has warned others to stay away. One of the wildest weeks on Wall Street comes to an end. Next, to look at the highs, the lows, and the tariffs, and how they could continue to shape and possibly rattle equity markets. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back. Stocks ended on a high note today following what could only be described as a quite volatile week of trading, linked, among other things, President Trump's policy on tariffs. William D. Cohen joins me now. He is the co-founder and Wall Street author for Puck, which I subscribe to and highly recommend. William D. Cohen, I'll call you Bill for our conversation. You wrote something this week that I want to talk to our audience about because it explains the story behind the equity markets. And I want to read this. You are familiar with it, but I want my audience to be familiar with it. Forget the equity markets for a moment. The more telling signal of the coming financial calamity can be found in the bond market. Let me continue. After all, when people start freaking out about whether they'll get their money back as contractually agreed by the government or by corporations, while also worrying about receiving contractually agreed interest payments, the S, and I have to use that, S really starts hitting the fan. Explain.
Well, the bond market, first of all, Major, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And people don't really understand the bond market as well because, first of all, it doesn't get nearly the attention that the equity markets get. CNBC and others are not going on every day and talking about, individual bonds and how they're trading. But the bond market is where you go to determine how much risk people are interested in taking, what they are fearing about whether or not they're going to get paid back for the money they lend, whether money can even be lent because, when interest rates get very high or whether there's a credit freeze. And our whole economy runs, the grease of our economy is the bond market, is the credit market, is the loan market, is banks lending, it's institutions lending, it's investors lending. And if that pricing gets out of whack, as it did in the last week, or if it begins to dry up, as it has many times over the last, in the history of this country, it really leads very quickly to bankruptcies and recessions and people not being able to get access to the credit that they need to, say, buy a home, buy a car, buy appliances, buy the things that they borrow money to buy. And when that money begins to dry up, then the gears of the economy get gummed up very quickly.
And Bill, from your vantage point, it wasn't the instability in the bond markets or the signals that were being sent that were somewhat alarming to the White House that led to the president imposing the pause on all trading partners except China?
Well, that's what I understand to be the case. It's hard to know exactly what's in Donald Trump's mind and why he does certain things. But at first, Major, I think it's important to say that after he announced these tariffs last Wednesday, that there was a flight to quality, and bonds actually traded up, and the yield traded down, and then it quickly reversed, and we had a major reversal in the Treasury market with the yield on the 10-year Treasury getting up to 4.5% from below 4%. That's a very big move in a very short amount of time, and that's just the safest market, right? If you look at the yield on the high yield market, the junk bond market, the average yield in that market moved to 8.5%. From 7.5%, another major big move up. And basically, those are just red flags about investors and creditors getting very nervous about whether they're going to get repaid, whether they're going to be defaults, whether they're going to be bankruptcies, and very reluctant to lend money into that market because there's so much uncertainty. And again, the last thing we can stand at this point is a credit crunch or a credit freeze where the sources of capital being lent to people dry up and can't get access to that really at any price or any affordable price. And that just leads quickly to recessions.
And Bill, two things happened this week. We had two inflation prints, that's the terminology, but inflation numbers that suggested it was cooling and becoming a little bit more manageable, economically speaking. Then we had the University of Michigan Consumer Confidence Survey showing expectations for future inflation as high as they've been since November, brace yourself, of 1981. Which of those two is more important as far as you're looking into the future?
Well, unfortunately, it's the University of Michigan forward-looking inflation number. The inflation numbers we just got, as one of your previous guests said, were pre-tariff. And yes, pre-tariff inflation numbers were coming down in the first quarter and in March, and actually, began to restore consumer confidence. But very quickly, even 2 weeks before the tariffs, I had a piece, New York Times op-ed, where I talked about what was ended up happening, unfortunately, where consumer confidence was already beginning to crack. And you see this now post-tariff, where people's expectation is that inflation is going to rise. And it's not just like pie in the sky. I don't like Donald Trump. I think inflation is going to rise. It's, you put 145% tariffs on imported goods from our third largest trading partner, you're going to see prices rise. And especially at places like Walmart, where a large majority of what they sell is imported goods. And that's going to come into play very quickly.
Bill Cohen, I appreciate it. I hope you'll come back.
Thank you, Major. Really appreciate it, too.
Beyond the White House, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine resigns, while a Senate fight in Texas, well, that begins to take on some very sharp edges. Our reporter panel standing by to dig into that and many other political twists and turns. That's next here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for hanging out with us. There was kind of a tariff eclipse this week. It just sort of blotted out everything, but lots of other things happened. Administration firings, U.S. ambassador to Ukraine calls it quits. Here's some other things you might have missed in the political universe.
We have many countries that are coming to negotiate deals with us, and they're going to be fair deals, and in certain cases they're going to be paying substantial tariffs.
I think it was a big mistake, this Chinese escalation, because they're playing with a pair of twos.
Our best solutions to these challenges will not come from the broken politics practiced in Washington. They will come from us, and that's why I'm running for governor.
I'm announcing that I'm running for U.S. Senate against John Cornyn, who apparently is running again for his 5th term, which would put him there 3 decades. It's definitely time for a change in Texas.
So that was Ken Paxton announcing he's going to run against John Cornyn, basically accusing him of being an anti-MAGA hack. That was also Michael Bennet, who's currently United States Senate, a Democrat, going to run for governor in Colorado. Kim Reynolds, the sitting governor of Iowa, not running for re-election. Ilhan Omar, member of the House, member of the squad, not going to seek the Senate seat in Minnesota. Lots of stuff happened this week. This is a politics show. We missed almost all of it. My apologies. But to help us complete the process of uncoiling the week that was, Jake Traylor is a White House reporter for Political. Niall Stanage is White House columnist for The Hill. So I know we talked about the tariff eclipse. We'll get to that first, and then we'll get to some of the other stuff. Niall, who are the winners and losers in the White House?
So the winners were those who were arguing against such a maximalist approach. The doves, exactly. One of the really fascinating undercurrents to this story is that it does point to the fact that even though President Trump has the Republican Party in his grip, there are genuine divisions there within that, particularly on this tariff issue. So losers are people like Peter Navarro, wanted tariffs for years, the idea that it would force a revitalization of American manufacturing.
And possibly Howard Lutnick, who talks that line very aggressively. Too, the Commerce Secretary.
Right. People like Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, more on the winner side, more on the dovish side.
Very good. I want to ask you, Jake, about Ken Paxton, MAGA, Trump, because it seems to me the ferocity that Ken Paxton came out with against John Cornyn, member of the House, a Senate Republican leadership, in good standing, indicates to me he thinks there's a Trump endorsement coming, or at worst, a split endorsement where it goes to both. Do you have any read on that or any feel for that? You were on the campaign trail a lot. You know the Trump world pretty well.
That's right, and I'm born and raised from Texas.
Okay, what part?
Northeast Texas, tiny town called Gilmer.
Mm-hmm. Well, my first job was in a tiny town called Amarillo.
There you go. There you go. Far away, but that's how Texas works. Look, I think when we're talking about this race, that I think for a lot of us was a bit of a surprise that he threw his hat in the ring here, is an attempt from Paxton to approach Cornyn from the farther right, and he does appear to have a confidence that he's going to have this endorsement from Trump. We're also seeing Cornyn, though, in the same vein, be very positive of his relationship with the president.
Be very scrappy. This is going to be a throwdown.
There's this quote that I saw from a Texas GOP person that said this might be the nastiest race that he's seen in Texas in decades, and I think we've got two popular Texas individuals here that are both vying for this very, very important President Trump endorsement here.
And now there's a thing going on with Senate Democrats. 4 of them now punched out. Gene Shaheen in New Hampshire, Tina Smith in Minnesota, Gary Peters in Michigan, now Michael Bennet in Colorado.
Yeah,
they're heading for the gates, the exits.
That's right. And the interesting thing about Bennet is he represents much more of the sort of centrist tendency in the Democratic Party. It turns out that as he's seeking the governorship, he's actually in a primary against a more left-wing Democrat, a more progressive Democrat. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that part of it plays out. But you're right. I mean, in terms of the Senate and these retirements, that is a pretty bad sign, I think you would say, for the Democratic Party. Yes, there's an argument that they need a new generation of leadership. You can be revitalized in that way. But people wanting to get out, never a great sign.
Jake, what was the vibe at the White House this week? It was a tumultuous week of their own creation. They did have a successful application of presidential power through Truth Social on the House budget and the resolution getting through. That's not to be overlooked. That was a big win.
It's certainly true. I would say the vibe at the White House this week was, though, fully eclipsed by this tariff conversation, what was going on. What I thought was really
And the internal infighting that Niall was talking about.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, too, is the way that the White House itself initially branded this entire tariff switch-up that we saw from the president in terms of his strategy, saying this was art of the deal, the plan all along. POTUS himself is telling us it was actually via Sunday and Monday conversations where he, in his words, noticed that the American consumer was yippy, that he decided to change that strategy. And so we actually had this kind of conflicting White House and POTUS communication about how the actual decision came down to actually change and make the pause on tariffs.
And now it's my impression that Senate and House Republicans were begging the White House for something approximating a pause. They'd heard about it on Monday. The White House tamped all that down. Oh, fake news, fake news. There's never going to be a 90-day pause. Right. Oop, wait, 2 days later, there was one.
Right. And it's not only about the pause, Major. I mean, to the point about the Senate, you had 7 Republican members of the Senate back in a measure that would have wrested tariff power back to them rather than having it solely with the president. That, I think, speaks to the kind of nervousness that you're talking about. The idea that people don't really want a president who's frankly as volatile as President Trump is to be in charge of this. You were talking in an earlier segment about uncertainty. There's always going to be uncertainty with President Trump at the helm.
Now, I'd like your perspective on two other things. Where things are with Russia and Ukraine, and where these things might lead on Saturday with Steve Witkoff talking to the Iranians.
Well, where do we begin?
Easy stuff, I know.
15-second
This
version
is
of that.
Masters weekend. Those are 2-foot putts. Come on now.
So on one hand, we have obviously the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine departing, right. And who would want that job, to be fair? I mean, that's an extraordinarily difficult needle to thread for her.
This is a bad time for that to happen.
It is. Whenever
it doesn't look good.
It doesn't look good, and at the same time, there's all this tension of exactly how much pressure is the Trump administration willing to put on Vladimir Putin. Witkoff over there at the moment. A lot of moving pieces to that in an extraordinarily sensitive situation.
Jake, your thoughts. Bring us home.
Yeah, I think it is, again, in a week focused on tariffs. This is not necessarily the look of what maybe the White House is necessarily looking for. But also, I would note that the ambassador was appointed under Biden. There's been some recent conflict with President Zelensky in Ukraine, being critical of the ambassador. And so this felt, again, at an odd time, but also as we're seeing the president and his team attempt to negotiate with Ukraine, with Zelensky, also now having this tariff embargo going on globally as well.
Wrapping up the week for us expertly, Jake Traylor, Niall Stanage. Thank you. I appreciate it. Come back, please. Trump administration is looking at very large climate research cuts at NOAA. What that move could mean for the weather agency's climate change work and overall research and forecasting abilities. That's next, right here on America Decides. It's Friday, you are here. Thanks for being with us. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, better known as NOAA, is facing significant budget cuts. A memo obtained by CBS News finds the agency's 2026 budget may be slashed by more than $1.5 billion compared to this year's budget levels. NOAA's research functions would be, according to this memo, the hardest hit. Now, it's important to note that President Trump has not yet approved this budget cut, but the OMB director has. And that makes it very real indeed. Former NOAA Administrator Rick Spinrad joins me now. Rick, thanks for joining us on such short notice. What impact would this have if it were to happen?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Major, and thanks for paying attention to this important story. The impact would be across the nation, across sectors. It would affect just about every American, almost every industry and every community. These misguided cuts are really basically saying, especially when you cut research out of the formula, that what we've got right now in terms of our ability to predict these devastating weather events, climate change impacts, that's good enough. We don't need to make any improvements, and that will cause serious problems.
Because, as I understand it, if you stop measuring, that doesn't mean you're stop experiencing the effects of climate change-driven weather patterns. You're just not understanding what's going on or what may happen in the future.
Exactly. I'd love to sit here and tell you, Major, that we know everything about how tornadoes form, how hurricanes form, how tsunamis form. But the fact is we need to continue doing research so that we can improve those forecasts. With people dying, 400 people dying from hurricanes in the Southeast last year, are we really prepared to say, yeah, that's okay? We don't need to make any improvements. So when you cut the research, you cut the ability to improve the forecasts and the predictions. And it's not just hurricanes or tornadoes. The climate side of things includes seasonal outlooks of precipitation, which are used obviously by the agricultural community. The insurance and reinsurance industry wants information about, are we going to have a particularly hot summer? You know, it's 98 degrees in Phoenix today. What's it going to be like in July? The research that will tell us, hey, we got a pretty good idea of what it's going to be like in July in Phoenix has been cut. So we're basically saying, nope, we're not going to make any improvements on that anymore.
And Rick, I don't need to tell you this, you experienced this at NOAA, but there are weather patterns that are exacting different and new costs on American communities as they adjust to tornadoes that come in seasonal ways that they haven't or come in ways that they haven't ever come before. They're living with these consequences, and they don't know how to build in their risk premiums or their risk expectations.
A really good point. I like to tell audiences these are not your parents' hurricanes or tornadoes or severe weather outbreaks, floods and droughts. Think about it. Think about Hurricane Harvey just a couple of years ago dropped 5 feet of rain on Houston. Hurricane Helene and the impact it had on Tennessee and Kentucky and North Carolina. And then Hurricane Milton spawned over 100 tornadoes in Florida. These are very unusual kinds of events. These storms are bigger, they're wetter, they're more powerful. So we better get a handle on what their predictability is in the future.
And Rick, very quickly, when the administration says, as I expect it will, well, we're not changing the forecasting budget, so everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, it's the ability to make that forecast is not just what happens within the National Weather Service. The research contributes to that. It's interesting. One of our abilities to improve hurricane forecasts is because researchers have learned to measure the ocean and are doing that and are contributing. Every time NOAA flies a hurricane hunter through a hurricane, there are researchers on board. They will not be on those planes if this budget goes through.
Rick, I appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The exit interview. Democratic Senators Tina Smith and Gary Peters are not seeking re-election in 2026. Next, their thoughts on the White House, Washington politics, and the state of the Democratic Party. You are watching America Decides. Welcome back. At the top of the ticket in 2024 for Midwestern Democrats, he was all pretty grim. However, there were down-ballot Senate victories in Wisconsin and Michigan. So how does the party think about its prospects in the Midwest going forward? Well, to do so, it's going to have to consider those prospects without Minnesota Senator Tina Smith and Michigan Senator Gary Peters. Why? Because neither is seeking re-election. Caitlin Huey-Burns sat down with both to get a sense of their future and the Democratic Party's future.
So you both are in your 60s and you are retiring. I mean, that is a young age for senators. It's kind of rare to retire at your age. Why now?
When I leave in 2 years, I'll be 68 years old. And everybody says, you are so young. I go, I love the Senate for that.
I would say only in the United States Senate can you be a 67-year-old grandma and they're calling you like the fresh new thing.
So why not stay then?
I didn't come here saying, I'm going to be here the rest of my life. And I believe in what our founders thought, that you would go to Congress, you're a citizen, you go to Congress, you serve, and then you go back to wherever you came from and live the rest of your life.
What is it about the institution, you think, that incentivizes people to stay for so long?
Well, the Senate is a very seniority-driven institution, and power comes from how long you've been there. It's always been this way. This is not a new thing. The longer you're there, the more likely you are to run a committee, the more likely you are to become a leader. And so that is a big reason why people stick around. And I think actually one of the things that we need to do is think about how to reform the Senate so that also there isn't so much power in the hands of just a few people.
If you're chair of the committee or a ranking member, you can be there as long as you'd like. Probably having a little more turnover there makes sense as an institutional reform.
Are you worried that by leaving your seat, it could flip to Republicans?
So between a deep bench and what I believe will be a good Democratic year, I'm confident we will elect a Democratic senator from Michigan this election.
Do you feel the same about Minnesota?
I also believe that having some competition is actually good. It's interesting. I think it engages voters when they have a chance to, understand like who their next leader might be, and they feel that their voice is going to be really important in choosing that leader. So I don't think we should be afraid of the competition.
How important do you think it is to have new blood as part of the party?
I think that our party is in the midst of a big generational a transition, and I think that that's good for the party. And incredibly strong leaders that have been in these positions of leadership for decades in some senses. And I think that as there are new voices stepping in, that is going to be reinvigorating for us.
Having that new energy come in is incredibly healthy for our democracy.
I mean, there's age, but there's also issues, right? I mean, Bernie Sanders is up there, as we know, but he is speaking to issues that younger folks in the base resonate with.
Well, I think that voters see a lot in our system that is broken, that isn't working. And when they hear leaders say, oh, we need to return to the past, or we need to just protect where we are, they're not looking for that. They're looking for somebody who's ready to challenge the status quo and not just sort of defend it.
You've announced your retirements at a time that the Democratic base seems to be a little bit upset with Democratic lawmakers. They feel, and we've seen this in town halls, they feel like you guys are not pushing back hard enough against the Trump administration, that you're not doing enough, they want you to do more.
I think that a lot of Americans have been looking at what's happening in Washington, and their attitude is basically like, the house is on fire. Like, this is a very bad situation. We're seeing challenges to our democracy. We're seeing a president who is basically not abiding by the laws of this land in a way that is really upsetting to them and scary to them. And Democrats, I think, need to hear that and respond to it, and not just say, oh, don't worry, everything is going to be fine.
So you mentioned the Democratic Party being a big tent. Is there someone in the party right now who you think represents the party? Who would you kind of identify as the leader of the Democratic Party right now?
I think there are a lot of leaders of the Democratic Party. Just like we're a big tent, there are a lot of voices out there. There's a disadvantage when you don't have a presidential candidate. That's not unique to the time we're in right now. There's a bully pulpit that a president has that you'll never be able to equal. That just doesn't happen.
And you're both from the Midwest. Trump won your state. He didn't win yours, but Republicans have been more competitive. Is there an area where you think Democrats should be working with President Trump right now?
Certainly, I think we have to find ways that we can work with President Trump, and if particularly related to the economy, if there are things that are going to be helpful to folks in their daily lives, we can't just be all no. And I don't believe that all no. Then if you're always no on everything, then basically you're irrelevant.
How do you think right now on tariffs?
I represent a state that has big agricultural interests like Gary does. Also, we're the home of the Iron Range, which produces most of the raw iron that goes into American-made steel. So targeted tariffs that go after bad actors, go after unfair ways that other countries close down their markets for Minnesota pork, or that flood our country with highly subsidized steel, is bad for American workers, it's bad for our economy.
And Caitlin Huey-Burns joins me now. If you recognize that venue, ladies and gentlemen, from previous episodes of the long-forgotten, but maybe coming back, you never can be sure, Takeout, well, that's the Dubliner in Washington, D.C., so that's a great venue.
We've been inspired by you. You inspired us to go there ourselves.
So at one point, Tina Smith, the senator from Minnesota, says, yeah, some Democrats think the House is on fire, and yet they're leaving. And two other Senate Democrats are leaving, Jeanne Shaheen and Michael Bennet.
Yeah, Michael Bennet announcing today that he's going to run for governor in his home state of Colorado. And in that statement, he said that he believes he can do more outside of Washington than in this body, which tells you a lot right now. And I thought it was interesting that both of these senators, they're in their late 60s, which is very young by Senate standards, but they are trying to make a point here with their exits that you can have a whole other life beyond the Senate. You don't have to stay until you are, into your 90s. I mean, they watched their colleague, Dianne Feinstein, for example. They are both planning careers and lives outside of Congress after their term ends.
And maybe they feel this thing that Senator Smith referred to, the transition with the Democratic Party to a new, younger generation of leadership, and they don't want to be ousted by that push.
And they both said that it's good to have some of this younger blood, that they hope that their exits allow some more competition within the party, too, to kind of help rise up the ranks. But I thought it was so notable and so true. The reason that senators stay so long is because it takes so long to get seniority, and seniority equals power on these committees. Yep. How do you change that? The House has worked on it. The Senate needs to.
Our thanks to Caitlin Huey-Burns for the interview and the Dubliner for the venue. That does it for today. I'll be back with another edition of America Decides Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.